Module 13, Pre-Digital Corpora, Part 2. So, in our earlier module, we have emphasized how pre-digital corpora are used in lexicographic activities. Here, in this module, we'll identify some other areas where also pre-digital corpora are used. Those main areas are the area of lexical study, grammar writing, speech study, language pedagogy, language acquisition, stylistic studies, and some other fields. Everywhere we are trying to show how handmade language corpora are used in different ways by different scholars to achieve their goals, even if no technology or digital corpora available to them. First, the corpora in lexical study. Edward Thorndike was the first scholar, perhaps, who developed a large database for the purpose of lexical study of English. He manually compiled a database of nearly 4.5 million words. Just imagine the amount of words he collected from various printed documents for lexical analysis, which eventually led him to publish the Teacher's Word Book in 1921. So he manually collected 4.5 million words. In the following years also, he added numerous text samples from magazines, periodicals, and juvenile literature with the existing database to turn into a huge database of 18 million words. So 1921, he compiled this, and eventually subsequent analysis of the data he collected resulted in publications of the Teacher's Handbook of 30,000 words that contained several word lists showing the relative frequency of occurrences of words in various text types. So, whole credit goes to Edward Thorndike because he was the first, perhaps the first scholar who collected. In fact, publication of this book provided a solid empirical support to the language teachers to determine which type of words they need to teach in the class and which type of words should they emphasize on while they compile the basic vocabulary or some teaching materials to the learners. Scholars like Thorne actually used those databases to develop a basic writing vocabulary in 1926 based on the data of the compiled by Edward Thorndike. Also, the pre-electronic handmade databases were also used to generate the lexical stock to be used for foreign language teaching, particularly English as a foreign language. In this effort, the work of Palmer occupied the most important place because it created a lasting impact on compilation of foreign language dictionary for teaching English. And in all those cases, we know that these people depended on huge corpus to collect data for developing dictionaries, the glossaries, and teaching materials. Charles Price, in connection with the study of usage of English words and lexicon, is also considered as an early and original work based on the analysis of large size manually compiled databases. Precisely, this is one of the most original and thoughtful studies on the usage of English words, in which he has made some attempts to establish the independent social criteria categorizing the style of expressions of the people. So, Charles Price's work in 1940 is also dependent on large amount of corpus which he directly used. Grammar writing. The grammarians and textbook writers of the earlier centuries or years are often motivated by their native language intuitions and linguistic efficiencies for writing general as well as pedagogical grammar for languages. We know that. Since this was mostly reluctant to rely on the language database of language use, their works are often refer to uncommon words, ignoring the most common ones. So this has been one of the great fallacies in the writing of the grammar books, because the people who were engaged in writing grammars, they hardly depended or relied on the corpus or database of actual language use, rather than they depended on their texts or intuitions. So what happened in that cases, they mostly went for a what should I say, uncommon usage of words, intuitively constructed sentences than which are actually found. But in the early 20th century, the strategy or the approach slightly changed, particularly Postma and Krisinger, dependent on large databases of language, a large set of sentences collected from various English newspapers and imaginative texts such as novel and short stories to collect sentences and other important properties of grammar to compile dictionary, grammar books. In a similar fashion also, Otto Jespersen compiled large list of illustrated examples of sentences from various sources of text to analyze the basic form and structure of English sentences. So these databases were, however, inevitably skewed to a large extent to include examples of unusual as well as interesting constructions at the expense of normal sentences found to be used heavily by the language users. So we noted that some scholars also collected large number of examples, sentences, illustrative sentences to write grammars. But most of the time, they tilted their attentions towards the unique, uncommon, rare, or interesting constructions rather than the most frequent, common, recurrent, and regular usages. So that was a new approach. Perhaps they wanted to see how it can be done, or how the uniqueness of the sentence or the constructions can be addressed. So their preference may be different, but the approach was more or less empirical, because they relied on the instances they collected from the use of the data by common people. The work of Charles Price, which was published in 1952, is an authentic example of a descriptive grammar in English, because it is based on the analysis of a lexical list created by transcribing a few normal telephonic conversations, a very unique one. Later analysis of the corpus yielded some interesting observations about the normal speech habits of the people, which is not known. For instance, 4,000 to 5,000 different words or types were used in those telephonic conversations that accounted for nearly 95% of the vocabulary of the written texts. Very interesting observation. Similarly, there were nearly 1,000 type words of the speech that covered 85% of the vocabulary of the written texts. Also, the most 50 frequently used function words accounted for about 60% of the speech. So there are various different kinds of statistical studies were taken from it. The basic argument is something like that the early grammarians, although mostly were intuitive in nature, they also depended on large collections of actual language use of different sentence types to construct or write grammar books or formulate new rules of grammar in the language. The area of speech study or speech varieties were invariably dependent on language corpus. So, even today, whenever we try to study the speech or speech varieties across localities or across a large geographical or geographical range, there is no other way than to depend on the actual use of language by the people. So the basic argument is that whenever you are going to study the speech, you need to depend on the corpus also. So generation of corpus or small corpus spoken text is not a very difficult task in those days when there are some strategies for collecting speech data. If you look back, we can find out that in cases of understanding the properties of speech, we need to record those speeches. Also, we need to identify the number of words which are normally used in speech. Also, you need to record the speech, how people use them. So, it was very clear to those earlier scholars that if they want to understand how people use language in their spoken interactions, what kind of vocabulary they use, what kind of constructions they prefer in use in speech, what kind of fillers they use, what kind of words are more frequent in occurrence in speech, how the sentences are constructed. All those information can be retrieved only when we have a good speech database ready for our access and utilization. So it is almost clear to them. But since no advanced tool or methods were available to them, they had to depend on two ways. Either they used a traditional tape recorder to collect data, or sometimes they could hear the texts and rewrite the entire thing, reproduce the entire thing on piece of paper by writing, then analyze the things. But the basic argument is very simple. Without reference to the actual use of language in spoken interactions, for earlier scholars also, it was nearly impossible to study the speech or the properties of speech, even when there was no spoken text were available. Language pedagogy is an important area to study. What is that? The pedagogical linguistics wanted to know how learners use language and what kind of text materials should be developed so that the learners can acquire better linguistic skills in all four methods of language use: writing, reading, comprehension, and communications. So it was necessary to know how the pedagogical purpose can be served. So there are two important things: that teaching language to the first language learners is one thing, and teaching language to the second language learners was another thing. In both cases, we need some resources developed from actual language use to understand how it works. So if we go back to the history, we can find out that let me give an example. Within a broader frame of language pedagogy, earlier language corpora were compiled and analyzed to study the various aspects of lexical grammar with some definite pedagogical purposes. Between the year of 1950 and 1960, we noted that many scholars have developed large lexical databases of nearly 500,000 words or more of Indian English or written English to analyze them, to process them, and to retrieve necessary information for them. And those examples texts were collected from fictions, novels, essays, plays, short stories, and folk tales, and many other informative texts such as bulletins, journals, newspapers, and magazines. And this use corpus was mostly used for the two purposes: to verify if the English language learners are able to acquire mastery over the language as manifested in the language corpus, and to evaluate whether the traditional vocabulary list taught to the learners were similar to those the word list developed in the language corpus. So there was many attempts to study how language in the language pedagogy to find out how the learners are learning language and how information extracted from the corpora can be contributed towards developing the materials. In the area of language acquisition, we have also noted that people wanted to know how learners are actually acquiring language. So to test their linguistic skills, it was also necessary to compile database, to collect information from them and analyze them, so that we can get some ideas how people are actually using learner have used the language, and if there is any deficiency. In most cases, the data which are collected from the learners in the form of corpus. If we start with the say first half of the 18th century to the first of the 19th century, for nearly a century, majority of the language research acquisitions by children was carried out in the manner of diary study. What is that? The researchers were primarily based on some carefully selected parental diaries containing detailed recordings of locutions of children. These so-called diary-based language corpora were considered indispensable as normative databases for any research on language acquisition. In reality, subsequent speculations about learning abilities of children were made only after empirical analysis of these speech corpora, which were collected in the form of diary by the parents. This was a practice for centuries. Then it continued with collecting such as specialized speech corpora, continued for many years later on. So even in the 20th century, we come across different parameters, different scales are used for evaluating the performance of the learners in first language acquisitions. But in most cases, the analysis has been carried out on the large amount of data acquired from the learners. Stylistic studies is another important area where corpus has been of tremendous importance. The use of language corpora in stylistic studies or stylistic analysis of texts and that of authors was probably one of the oldest disciplines in the history of corpus-based language research. There are several instances that would help us to realize how handmade text corpora are used for stylistic researches before the language corpora are used in digital form for these purposes. For instance, the entire text of the Bible was utilized to generate a corpus on which experts made commentaries and criticisms. Even in the late 18th century, a few concordant list of words was made from the corpus of this Bible to verify the factual consistencies among various parts of the scripture. The list included all the major content words as well as the function words and collocations. The analysis of this enabled many researchers to shed new lights on the linguistic nature of the scripture. Similar works have been carried out on the works of Shakespeare to understand the chronological order of his plays, also to overcome the problems of stylistic variations, grammatical styles, forms of his plays, and many other things. Many attempts are made in earlier days to analyze the stylistic utilities, stylistic properties, stylistic uniqueness of individual authors with analysis of the entire creations of respective authors as a corpus. So we can find out that corpora of different types in pre-electronic era are used in different ways to understand various issues of languages and related factors in linguistics. There are some other areas also where this has been used. Let us mention that there are many areas are also there where corpora not in the pre-electronic corpora are used. For instance, that handmade corpora has made valuable contributions for the growth of maturity of the discipline of linguistics, because analysis of those handmade corpora contributed a lot to understand not only the basic primary properties and aspects of a language, but many other aspects which are not immediately addressed or discussed. The most notable among these areas is the comparative linguistics, which had shown evidence of its inclination for information obtained from language corpora also. So whenever we are studying between the languages, making a comparative study, we need to have a large data, and people also use the large amount of data for these purposes. Handmade corpora are also used to trade and identify the patterns of spelling variations of words in the language in earlier words. As you know, in 1897, a German scholar, Keidel, manually compiled a corpus of nearly 11 million words from various types of written texts to calculate the frequency distributions of letters, to count the sequence of letters in words, and to study the general spelling variations in German. Recently also, new modern corpora are being used for this purpose also. Then in statistical linguistics, in dialectology, in mathematical linguistics, and many other areas, we can identify that language corpora, pre-electronic language corpora, have been regularly used. So, to conclude, this is the second part of the survey, where we have tried to identify the major areas where corpora, handmade corpora of different form, of different types, are used to substantiate, to supplement the knowledge base of the experts involved in different activities. When we find that there is a strong tendency of the new generation of scholars to refer to language corpora directly or indirectly to study any particular aspects of language under investigation, it becomes imperative to know whether same type of attempt have been made at all in the past, in the history, and whether we are actually steps ahead from them. The survey is clearly giving an idea that importance of language data in the form of corpora or database of texts has immense value, not only in this age but also in earlier years, even before centuries also, because any good rational scientific study of the language invariably require the data, authentic reliable data, which is available only through corpora. Either it is available in electronic form or in pre-electronic person. But the relevance or importance of language corpora in different application-oriented research and development activities of linguistics is mandatory. So, these two modules relating to the survey once again confirms our argument that linguistic research and development activities should invariably depend on the knowledge, data, information available from language corpora. Thank you.